The desert sun bled out across the horizon, painting the sky in shades of blood and rust. Wind tore through the frontier town, a lonely sound that whipped dust into restless ghosts. In the center of the square, a man stood on a wooden block, his voice cracking the air like a bullwhip, selling off what was left of other people's lives. Before him stood an Apache woman. Her wrists were raw, bitten by iron shackles. Her shoulders were stooped, not from age, but from the crushing weight of cruelty. Scars crisscrossed her skin, a roadmap of a story nobody in that crowd cared to read. She was a ghost, breathing but not alive. The crowd jeered. They were vultures circling a carcass. Some threw pebbles that bounced off her bare feet. Others laughed, a jagged, ugly sound that fed on her pain. "She ain't worth a plug nickel," a man yelled, spitting a brown stream of tobacco into the dirt. The auctioneer, a greasy man with sweat stains under his arms, slammed his gavel. His voice was sandpaper. "Two. Who'll take the savage for two?" Silence. The kind of silence that's louder than a scream. It stretched and stretched, broken only by the snickers of ranchers with calloused hands and empty hearts. "Better food for the buzzards," one of them scoffed, slapping his dusty thigh. The Apache woman lowered her head. The shame was heavier than the chains. She prayed for the desert to open up and swallow her whole, but the world had run out of mercy for her a long time ago. The laughter felt like salt being rubbed into wounds that never healed. Then came a new sound. Boots, crunching, slow and steady against the hard-packed earth. The sound cut through the noise of the crowd, deliberate and heavy. Every head turned. A man emerged from the edge of the square. He was tall, broad, a silhouette carved from the mountain rock. He wore a weathered hat pulled low, his face lost in the shadow of its brim, and a beard that looked like it had been shaped by sandstorms and solitude. He was a ghost of a different kind. A cowboy few people knew, and even fewer spoke to. They said he had no family, no friends, no reason to care about a single soul in this God-forsaken world. He was a man made of silence. Yet he walked forward, his stride never faltering. Without a word, he reached into his pocket and tossed a small leather pouch onto the auction block. It landed with a soft, heavy thud. A couple of coins spilled out, catching the last of the dying sun. "She's mine," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it rumbled through the square like distant thunder. It was steady. It was final. The square erupted, not in cheers but in disbelief. "$2 for that?" A rancher cackled, slapping his knee. "The man's gone mad." Another one sneered, his face twisted with contempt. Even a hermit loses his senses eventually. But the cowboy didn't flinch. He didn't even look at them. His eyes, hidden in the shadows of his hat, were fixed on the woman. And he wasn't looking at her with hunger or even with pity. He was looking at her with something else, something that looked terrifyingly like recognition. He stepped forward, his boots stirring the dust, and reached for the chain connecting her shackles. The auctioneer, startled, fumbled with the keys. He was so eager to be done with the business that he practically threw the chain into the stranger's hand. The woman stiffened. Her whole body went rigid, bracing for the familiar jerk, the cruel pull of a new master. But it never came. Instead of yanking the chain, he lifted it gently, as if it were a fragile thread. His touch was firm but careful. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drum of confusion. She had only ever been touched by rope, by leather, by whips, never by anything that felt like respect. His rough hand brushed her skin as he worked the lock. Not a grab, not a shove, just a touch. He unlocked the shackles. They fell away, clattering into the dust. The sound was deafening. Then he did something that made the entire crowd gasp. He shrugged off his own coat. It was thick, worn, smelling of trail dust and wood smoke, and he placed it around her shoulders. It fell over her like a shield, covering the scars, the bruises, the shame. For the first time in years, she felt covered, not exposed. She was trembling, a leaf in a storm. But she found the strength to lift her gaze, to meet his eyes for the first time. And what she saw there shocked her more than any whipping ever had. There was no cruelty, no contempt. There was just a steady, unyielding, impossible humanity. The whispers spread through the crowd like a lit fuse. He's lost his mind. What's a man like him want with her? Biggest waste of $2 I've ever seen. The cowboy paid them no mind. With the woman walking close at his side, her bare feet shuffling in the dust, he turned and walked away. He walked right through the heart of the crowd, through the mocking laughter and the spitting jeers. He felt the weight of every hateful stare, but he never slowed, and he never looked back. She stumbled, weak from hunger and thirst. His arms shot out, steadying her without a word. Each step away from that auction block felt like a step away from the grave. The last light of the sun vanished, and the town's ugly noise began to fade, replaced by the endless, whispering song of the desert wind. They stopped at a rocky outcrop far from the flickering lights of the settlement. The cowboy dropped his pack and began to gather wood for a fire. She stood watching, her body coiled like a spring, every muscle screaming with suspicion. This was a trick. It had to be a trick. Men who paid for you owned you. They didn't offer you their coat. Why? The word tore from her throat, fragile and raw, her first word in what felt like a lifetime. He looked at her then, his face finally clear in the rising moonlight. It was a face carved by hardship, his eyes as steady as the stones around them. Because no one deserves to be left in chains, he said. It was that simple. No grand promise, no hidden demand. Just a plain truth that burned hotter than any branding iron. She stared at him, searching his face for the lie, for the deceit she knew had to be there. But there was none. The fire he built was small but warm, a crackling point of light beneath a vast, star-dusted blanket of black. He offered her a piece of hard bread and a tin cup of water. She hesitated, her hand trembling, before she took it. The water was the best thing she had ever tasted. The bread filled an ache in her stomach that had been there for years. He asked nothing of her. He said almost nothing else. His silence was different out here. In town, it had been a threat. Out here, it felt like the wilderness itself, wide open and unthreatening. She watched him from across the flames. The orange glow lit the hard lines of his face, his broad shoulders. His eyes reflected the fire, two tiny embers in the darkness. Her fear was still there, a cold knot in her gut, but something else was stirring, a tiny, dangerous flicker of curiosity. The fire's warmth was a fragile shield against the cold night. She pulled his coat tighter around her. The smell of him, leather and smoke and earth, filling her senses. Was this kindness? Or was it just a different kind of cruelty, one she hadn't learned yet? But he didn't move closer. He didn't try to touch her. He didn't pry into her pain. He just sat there, sharpening a knife with slow, deliberate strokes of a whetstone. He moved as if the chaos of the world couldn't touch him, as if he operated on his own time, by his own rules. Her mind reeled. For as long as she could remember, shame and pain had been her only companions. They were the air she breathed. But here, under the endless stars, there was no whip. There was no jeering laughter. There were no eyes that saw her as less than human. There was only the silence, the fire, the man, and a fragile, terrifying hope that maybe, just maybe, this was real. The night deepened. Coyotes howled in the distance, their cries echoing in the canyons. She lay by the fire, her body aching, her mind too restless for sleep. The ghost of the chains still seemed to burn on her wrists, but beneath his coat, she felt a warmth that was more than just wool and leather. It was protection. Every time she closed her eyes, the faces from the crowd swam in her vision. The sneers, the spit hitting the dirt, the auctioneer's greedy eyes. But then, the cowboy's face would push through the nightmare. The way he had looked at her. Not as an object, not as a curse, but as someone worth saving. A single hot tear slipped down her cheek and sizzled in the dust. For the first time in years, she didn't feel completely alone. The stars above seemed to watch over her, vast and silent witnesses. The desert wind shifted, and it felt like it was carrying away the mocking voices that had haunted her for so long. She noticed the cowboy hadn't laid down to sleep. He sat upright, his back to the fire, his silhouette a solid shape against the starlight. He was watching the darkness, his gaze scanning the horizon. He was guarding her. Even in silence, even with his back turned, he was standing guard. And in that moment, a stunning realization hit her. He wasn't just a man who had bought her, he was a man who had chosen her. Not for work, not for pleasure, but for a reason she couldn't begin to understand. Her heart still trembled with a lifetime of fear. But deep inside her soul, an ember that she thought had been extinguished forever, flickered back to life. Just before she drifted into a fitful sleep, she saw him trace something in the dirt with the tip of his knife. It was a shape, a symbol. A winding river and a single star above it. A symbol she knew. A symbol from her own people. And the mystery of the silent cowboy deepened into a terrifying abyss. Dawn broke softly, brushing the plains with strokes of pale gold. The woman woke with a jolt, the silence itself a shock to her system. For a moment she expected the rattle of chains, the barked orders of a master. Instead she saw him. He was already awake, saddling his horse with a quiet, practiced efficiency. And next to where she had slept, a second blanket lay folded neatly. He had put it there in the night, while she slept, thinking of her comfort. When he caught her gaze, he didn't smile, didn't threaten. He just nodded. "We ride," he said. The words were a statement, not a command. She rose slowly, her body stiff and sore, but her spirit felt strangely lighter. She followed him as he led his horse, and another horse he'd had tied up nearby, into the uncertain promise of the new day. They rode for days, across barren flats where the wind howled a mournful song, through deep canyons where the rocks were the color of dried blood. He never pushed her. He never rushed their pace. His silence was a steady presence, an anchor against the storm of her memories. She wondered if he knew. Did he know that every mile they put between them and that town was another link of the chain breaking inside her? She wanted to ask him about the symbol he drew in the dirt. She wanted to demand answers, but the words were caught in her throat, tangled with fear and a fragile, budding trust. All she knew was that riding beside the silent man, she didn't feel invisible. They arrived at his homestead. It wasn't a ranch. It was a small, lonely cabin tucked into the base of a mesa, looking like it had grown right out of the red earth. It was a place built for solitude. He worked his small patch of land with weathered hands that knew the language of hardship. He mended fences. He fed the few livestock he kept. He carried water from a deep well, and he gave her space. He never ordered her to do anything. He never treated her like property. One day, as he was repairing a leather strap, she reached for the awl. He looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable, and then he simply handed it to her. He let her work beside him, their hands moving in a silent rhythm, as if she had always been there. At first, she barely spoke. Her voice was a rusty hinge from years of disuse. But slowly, like a spring thaw, fragments of her life began to surface. She told him about the songs her mother used to sing, about the taste of fish from the river where her people lived. She spoke of the night the soldiers came, the smell of smoke, the screams that echoed in her memory. He listened. He never interrupted. His eyes stayed on her, steady and kind. For years, her voice had been stolen from her. Now, with every word he listened to, it felt like he was carving out a space for her story in the vast, empty wilderness. He never asked the questions that would cut too deep. He just offered her his silence, and she filled it with her truth. And with every story she told, she felt the crushing weight of her past lift. Just a little. The scars on her soul began to feel less raw. She realized she wasn't just surviving anymore. She was breathing, but their fragile peace was about to be shattered. They ran out of flour and salt, and a trip to town became unavoidable. The moment they rode down the main street, the whisper started again. The townsfolk stared, their eyes narrowed with suspicion and contempt. Some of them laughed outright, sneering that the crazy cowboy had saddled himself with damaged goods. The rancher from the auction, a big red-faced man named Barlow, stepped out of the saloon. He blocked their path, a cruel smirk on his face. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," Barlow drawled, his eyes crawling over her. "Still playing house with the savage, are you?" The cowboy's hand, which had been resting loosely on his saddle horn, tightened into a fist. Barlow took a step closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was loud enough for everyone to hear. "You'd better watch out. Her kind. They carry ghosts with them, the ghosts of all the good men they put in the ground." That was it. Something inside the cowboy snapped. Before anyone could blink, he was off his horse. He moved with a speed that was terrifying. He grabbed Barlow by the front of his shirt, lifting the bigger man half off his feet, and slammed him against the wall of the saloon. The wood groaned in protest. "You will not speak to her," the cowboy growled, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "Ever again." His eyes, usually so calm, were blazing with a fire she had never seen before. This wasn't just a man protecting his purchase. This was something deeper, something fiercely, violently personal. He released Barlow, who stumbled back, his face pale with shock and fear. The entire street had gone silent. Without another word, the cowboy turned, took her arm gently, and led her into the general store, leaving the town in a stunned, simmering silence. But she had seen it. In that flash of rage, she had seen the truth. This man wasn't just a quiet homesteader. He was a man with ghosts of his own, and she had a terrible feeling that his ghosts and her ghosts knew each other very well. The ride back to the cabin was thick with a new, heavy silence. The shared quiet that had once been a comfort now felt like a wall between them. The explosion in town had changed everything. It had uncovered a piece of him that was dark and violent, a piece that didn't fit with the gentle man who had given her his coat. When they got back, she turned to face him, her heart pounding. The fear was back, cold and sharp. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice trembling. He wouldn't meet her eyes. He busied himself with the horses, his movements stiff and unnatural. "I asked you a question," she pressed, stepping in front of him. "That man, Barlow, it wasn't just what he said. It was how you looked at him. You know him." He finally stopped, his shoulders slumping. He looked old, tired. He ran a hand over his face, the gesture of a man worn down to the bone. "I knew him," he said, his voice rough. "A long time ago." "How?" He let out a long, shuddering breath. "I wasn't always a cowboy. Before this, I was a soldier." The word hit her like a physical blow. A soldier. The men who had burned her village. The men who had taken her. The men who had destroyed her world. Her mind flashed back to the symbol he had drawn in the dirt that first night. The river, the star. It was the mark of her village, a place only her people and the men who had destroyed it would know. The puzzle pieces were clicking into place, and the picture they were forming was a nightmare. "You were there," she whispered, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "That night, you were one of them." He finally looked at her, and the pain in his eyes was so vast it threatened to swallow her whole. He didn't deny it. He couldn't. "I was," he admitted, his voice cracking. "I was there." The fragile trust they had built shattered into a million pieces. The kindness, the coat, the shared work. Was it all a lie? Was it just guilt? Was he trying to buy his own forgiveness for $2? She backed away from him, her body shaking with a fury so cold it burned. "You bought me," she hissed, "to erase your sin." "No," he said, taking a step toward her. "That's not—" "Don't touch me," she screamed, the sound ripping from her throat. She felt trapped again, not by chains of iron, but by chains of deceit. She turned and ran. She didn't know where she was going. She just knew she had to get away from him, from the cabin, from the lies. She ran out into the wilderness, tears streaming down her face, the man's confession echoing in her head. But the wilderness held its own dangers. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs gave out. Finally collapsing in a small wooded ravine, she was lost, alone. And for the first time since he'd bought her, she felt the terrifying weight of true despair. He hadn't freed her. He had just moved her from one cage to another. As dusk began to settle, she heard a sound. Not the cowboy. Something else. 3 men on horseback appeared at the ridge of the ravine. They weren't white men. They were Apache, warriors. Their faces were painted for a hunt, and their eyes were hard. One of them, the leader, dismounted and walked toward her. His face was familiar, a face from her childhood. "Nita," he said, using her name for the first time since she'd been taken. It was her cousin, Kyle. Relief washed over her, so powerful it made her dizzy. Her people. They had found her. But the relief died the moment she saw the look on Kyle's face. It wasn't a look of welcome. It was a look of cold, hard judgment. "We tracked the soldier," Kale said, his voice flat. "We saw you with him, living in his house, eating his food." "He bought me," Nita tried to explain. "He saved me from—" "He is one of them," Kyle spat. "One of the men who burned our home. And you share his fire? You are a traitor to our people." They saw a woman who had chosen to live with the enemy. They didn't see a survivor. They saw a disgrace. "You will come with us," Kyle commanded. "You will answer to the elders for your shame." Before Nita could react, a voice cut through the air. "She's not going anywhere." The cowboy stood at the other end of the ravine. He wasn't holding a gun. His hands were open at his sides. He had tracked her, followed her. Kyle and the other warriors drew their weapons. "This does not concern you, soldier," Kyle snarled. "Anything that concerns her concerns me," the cowboy said, his voice calm and steady, but with an edge of steel. Nita was trapped, caught between the man whose lies had broken her heart and the people whose judgment threatened to crush her spirit. She had to make a choice she never thought she'd have to make. Trust the man who was part of her past trauma, or go with the people who now saw her as a stain on their honor. Suddenly, the standoff was interrupted by a new sound, the thunder of a dozen horses coming fast. Up on the ridge, a posse of men appeared, rifles glinting in the twilight, and at their lead was Barlow. He had seen the Apache warriors from a distance, and he had used it as the perfect excuse. "See?" Barlow roared, his voice echoing through the ravine. "I told you, the hermit is harboring hostiles. They're planning a raid." The townsfolk, their faces twisted with fear and hatred, raised their rifles. Now Nita, the cowboy, and her own people were all caught in the same trap. The fragile peace of the wilderness had exploded into a prelude to a massacre, and they were all standing right in the kill zone. "Get down!" the cowboy yelled, diving for Nita and pulling her behind a cluster of rocks just as the first shot rang out. The bullet ricocheted off the stone with an angry whine, spraying them with chips of granite. Kyle and his warriors scattered, finding their own cover. The ravine erupted into a chaotic symphony of gunfire and shouting. Barlow's men were positioned on the high ground, firing down into the trap they had sprung. "We have to move!" the cowboy shouted over the noise, his face grim. "They have us pinned." Nita's mind was racing. Her anger, her sense of betrayal, it all evaporated in the face of hot lead. Survival took over. This man, this soldier who had been at the destruction of her home, was now the only thing between her and a bullet. "There's a fissure in the rock wall behind us," she yelled back, her knowledge of the terrain, learned in a childhood of freedom, kicking in. "It leads to a narrow wash. It might get us out of the crossfire." He nodded, his eyes scanning the ridgeline, calculating. "We'll have to draw their fire. On my signal, you run. Don't look back." He saw Cale pinned down behind a sparse juniper bush. "Cover me!" the cowboy yelled to him. Cale stared at him for a beat, his face a mask of hate and confusion. But another volley of shots from above made the decision for him. He nodded curtly and fired a shot toward the ridge. The cowboy broke cover, sprinting across the open ground toward a better position, drawing a hail of bullets. He moved like a soldier, low and fast, his body accustomed to the deadly dance of combat. He reached a thicket of scrub oak and laid down, suppressing fire with his own rifle. "Nita, go! Now!" he roared. Nita ran. She scrambled for the fissure in the rock, the sound of gunfire deafening. She didn't look back. She trusted him. In that moment of pure chaos, she had no other choice. She squeezed through the narrow opening and found herself in a dry, sandy wash, shielded from the main line of fire. A moment later, Cale and the other two Apache warriors tumbled in after her, breathing heavily. Then came the cowboy, sliding in last, his arm bleeding from a deep graze. They were trapped in the wash, but they were alive, for now. The gunfire from above lessened as Barlow's men realized they had lost their targets. They would be coming down to hunt them. "We're sitting ducks in here," Kyle growled, glaring at the cowboy. "This is your fault, soldier." "His name is Silas," Nita said, the name sounding strange on her tongue. He had told her his name once, during a quiet evening by the fire. Silas ignored Kyle, tearing a strip of cloth from his shirt to bandage his arm. His face was a mask of intense concentration. They'll send men around both ends of the wash to box us in. We have maybe 5 minutes. And what do you suggest we do, soldier? Kale sneered. Surrender? I suggest you listen, Silas shot back, his voice sharp. He looked directly at Nita. This isn't random. Barlow wants more than just a fight. He wants us dead. He's a hateful man, Nita said. It's more than hate, Silas said, his eyes dark with memory. He finally looked at her, ready to tell her the whole truth, the final terrible piece of the puzzle. That night, he began, his voice low and strained. The raid on your village, it wasn't an official army command, it was an illegal order. Barlow was a lieutenant then. He'd heard rumors your people had found gold in the river. He organized the raid himself, using the men under his command. He told us it was a punitive strike against hostile warriors. He paused, the memory twisting his face in agony. It was a lie. There were no warriors. It was a massacre. For gold. Cal and his men stared, their expressions shifting from hostility to stunned horror. I was a private, Silas continued. Just a kid. When I realized what was happening, I refused to fire. Barlow drew his sword on me. He called me a traitor. He held up his left hand, showing them a faint pale scar across his palm. He cut me when I deflected a blow meant for a little girl hiding under a wagon. He looked straight at Nita. His voice dropped to a whisper. A little girl with a star-shaped birthmark on her shoulder. You. The air left Nita's lungs. The memory buried under years of trauma surfaced. A screaming man in a blue coat, a flash of steel, another soldier stepping between them, the sting of something sharp on her palm as she threw her hand up to protect her face. She looked down at her own hand, a tiny silver scar, a mirror image of his. It was him. He was the soldier who had saved her. Barlow ordered his men to take me into custody, Silas said. But in the chaos, I escaped. They listed me as a deserter. I've been living on the run ever since, trying to disappear, but I never forgot. I spent years searching, listening to whispers, trying to find out what happened to the survivors of that raid. To you. When I heard about an Apache woman being sold at auction in this territory, I had to see. He finally looked away, shame etched on his face. The $2. It was all I had left in the world. The ravine was silent, save for the whisper of the wind. Cale stared at Silas, seeing him for the first time not as an enemy, but as something else entirely. An ally. He murdered our chief, Cale said, his voice thick with a new kind of rage. Your father, he said to Nita. Barlow killed him himself. The confession hung in the air, a truth so monstrous it reshaped their entire world. This wasn't a fight about prejudice anymore. It was about justice. It was about vengeance. He can't let any of us live, Silas said grimly. We're the only ones who know the truth of what he did. Nita looked at Silas, her savior and her captor, the source of her pain and the reason for her survival. She looked at Cale, her kin who had judged her. They were all bound together by the same fire, the same ghost. And on the ridge above them, the man who lit that fire was coming to finish the job. Nita took a deep breath. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, clear purpose. You know his tactics, she said to Silas. And we, she said, looking at Cale, know this land better than he does. An alliance was forged in that dusty wash, born from a shared history of pain and a common enemy. The soldier, the survivor, and the warriors. Let's go hunt a ghost, Nita said, her voice steady as iron. The plan was desperate, forged in whispers while the sound of Barlow's men scrambling down the rocky slopes grew closer. Silas, with his military knowledge, laid out the tactics. Cale and his warriors, with their intimate understanding of every rock and shadow, refined it. And Nita, the bridge between their two worlds, held it all together. They'll expect us to run down the wash, Silas explained. We're going to go up. Kyle, you and your men will split off. Create a diversion at the far end of the ravine. Make them think we're trying to break out. Kyle nodded, his eyes glinting. We will give them ghosts to chase. Nita and I will double back, Silas continued, looking at her. We're going after Barlow. If we take him out, the rest of them will scatter. It was a suicide mission, but it was the only way. Cale clasped Silas's shoulder, a gesture of respect that would have been unthinkable an hour ago. May your aim be true, soldier. Then he and his men melted into the shadows of the wash, moving with a silence that was supernatural. Ready? Silas asked Nita. She clutched the small hunting knife he had given her days ago. I've been ready my whole life, she whispered. They scrambled up the steep side of the wash, using handholds she knew from childhood. They moved through the twilight like specters, circling back toward the ridge where Barlow was directing his men. They could hear him shouting orders, his voice full of arrogant certainty. Suddenly, a volley of shots echoed from the far end of the ravine. Kel's diversion. He's chasing shadows, Barlow yelled with a laugh. Go! Go! Finish them off! Most of his men charged down into the ravine, leaving Barlow and two guards on the ridge, silhouetted against the last of the evening sky. It was the opening they needed. Silas and Nita crept closer, using the scrub brush as cover. They were 20 yards away, then 10. One of the guards turned, sensing something. Silas moved first. He rose from the brush, his rifle already at his shoulder. A single, clean shot, and the guard dropped. The second guard spun around, raising his weapon, but Nita was already moving. She burst from cover, a blur of motion, and drove her knife into his side. He grunted, collapsing. Barlow stared, his face a mask of pure shock. He fumbled for his pistol, his eyes wide with disbelief as he saw Silas and Nita standing before him. You, he breathed, looking at Silas. The deserter. The witness, Silas corrected, his rifle aimed steady at Barlow's chest. Barlow's eyes darted to Nita, and a flicker of recognition, of old evil, crossed his face. And the whelp. I should have killed you myself when I had the chance. You did, Nita said, her voice cold and clear. You killed that little girl, but I am the woman who survived to see you pay for it. Barlow laughed, a crazed, desperate sound. Pay? There's no law out here but the gun, and my men will be back any second. They're a little busy, Silas said calmly. Barlow saw the trap. He made a desperate lunge, not for his gun, but to shove Silas off the edge of the ridge. But Silas was ready. He sidestepped, bringing the butt of his rifle around in a hard arc that caught Barlow square in the jaw. The man staggered back, spitting blood, and then he ran. He scrambled down the rocks, heading for his horse. He's getting away, Nita cried. No, he's not, Silas said. He didn't raise his rifle. He just watched. Barlow reached his horse, but as he tried to mount, a figure stepped out from behind a boulder. It was Cale. He wasn't alone. His warriors and a dozen more from their tribe who had been drawn by the sounds of battle emerged from the darkness. They surrounded Barlow, a silent, deadly circle of judgment. There was no trial. There was no court. There was only the frontier's harsh justice. They took Barlow, and he was never seen again. His men, hearing the battle turn and finding their leader gone, fled into the night. The dust settled. The silence returned to the ravine, deeper than before. Silas and Nita stood on the ridge, looking down as her people gathered. Cale looked up at them and gave a single solemn nod. The debt was paid. In the days that followed, the story unraveled. With Barlow gone, people started talking. Truths that had been buried under fear for years came to light. He was exposed not as a rancher, but as a murderer and a thief. Nita's people, her family, welcomed her back. They treated her not as a disgrace, but as a hero, a survivor who had brought justice for their tribe. They offered her a place of honor among them. You should go with them, Silas told her one evening, as they stood outside the small cabin. It's where you belong. He looked at the home he had built, a monument to his loneliness. My part in this is done. The ghost has been put to rest. He was setting her free, for real this time. It was the ultimate act of his atonement. He was giving her back her life, her people, her world. Nita looked toward the distant campfires of her village, where she could hear the sounds of drumming and song, her home. Then she looked back at Silas, the silent cowboy, the haunted soldier, the man who had paid his last $2 not for a slave, but for a chance at redemption. She thought of the auction block, of his coat around her shoulders, of the quiet way he listened to her stories, of the fury in his eyes when Barlow insulted her, of the way he had stood between her and death, not once, but twice. Her past was with her people, but her future was something she had to choose for herself. You once told me I could stay because I choose, she said softly. He nodded, his heart aching. And you should choose them. No, she said, and for the first time, she stepped closer to him, not out of need or fear, but out of pure choice. She reached out and took his scarred hand in hers. You bought a person for $2, Silas, but you didn't buy a slave. You bought a partner. He looked at her, stunned, as she intertwined her fingers with his. My home is not just a place, she said, her eyes shining with a strength he had never seen. It is where I am respected. It is where I am free. It is where my heart is. She squeezed his hand. My home is here, with you, if you'll have me. The lonely cowboy who had walked the frontier with only shadows for company looked at the woman who had once been called worthless, and he saw his future. He saw his peace. He saw his home. Together they rewrote the story the world had tried to force on them. Their life wasn't marked by riches or power, but by something far greater, the quiet strength of two broken souls who found each other in the dust and built a life the world could never tear down. The chains had tried to define her, and guilt had tried to define him. But in the end, they set each other free. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments what part moved you the most. And let us know, where in the world are you watching from?